Somebody help her. Please. The words came out of the old man in a voice that had already given up on being heard, and around him a dozen people kept their phones raised and their feet planted, close enough to smell the blood on his mouth, but not close enough to touch it. There were four of them standing over him in the parking lot of a shuttered feed store, and every single person who saw it did the exact same thing. They watched. Nora Keene was 24 years old, still in her coveralls, her hands still black from a transmission she'd finished 40 minutes past close. And she had about 8 seconds to decide whether she was the kind of person she'd always told herself she was. If your chest is already tight, if some part of you is already answering the question of what you'd have done, then stay to the end of this one, because it goes somewhere you won't expect. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what town you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The cold in Livingston, Montana that November came down off the Absaroka Range like it had a grudge, and by 5 in the afternoon the light was already the color of dishwater, and the wind was doing the thing it did in that town, the thing that made newcomers think something was wrong with the weather, until somebody explained that, no, this was just Livingston, this was just the wind coming through the Yellowstone Valley the way it had since, before anybody's grandfather. Nora had grown up in it. She didn't own a coat that wasn't rated to 20 below, and she'd stopped noticing the way it pushed against the shop's roll-up door, until the whole building groaned. She'd been at Reynard's garage since she was 19. August Reynard, who everybody just called Gus, was a wide, slow-moving man in his 60s with hands like catcher's mitts and a way of looking at an engine that reminded Nora of the way her grandmother used to look at a Bible, like the answers were all in there if you were patient and honest enough to find them. Gus had hired her off a handshake. She'd walked in the week after her father's funeral, 18 and furious and out of options, and Gus had looked at her chewed-down fingernails and the grease already ground into her knuckles from working on her dad's old truck in the driveway, and he'd asked her exactly one question. Can you show up every day, even the days you don't want to, and not make it my problem that you don't want to? She'd said yes. She'd meant it more than she'd meant almost anything. 5 years later, she was the best diagnostic tech in 100 miles, and she still made $22 an hour, because Gus's shop lived and died on locals, who paid in checks that sometimes needed a day or two to clear, and because half of what Nora fixed, she fixed for people who couldn't have afforded it anywhere else. Old Mrs. Petrosky's Buick, the Delgado's minivan with the 4 kids in the back, Cole Ferris's junk Civic that broke down more than it ran. Nora didn't keep a tally. She'd have told you she didn't have time to, but the truth was closer to the bone than that. She just didn't believe you got credit for the things you were supposed to do anyway. Her mother worked nights cleaning the hospital out on the east side of town, which meant most evenings the little rental on Geyser Street was empty when Nora got home. And most evenings she was too tired to mind. That was the shape of her life. Work, walk, sleep, work. The truck she shared with her mother had thrown a water pump in September, and they hadn't scraped together the part yet. So Nora walked the 25 minutes home when her mother had the car. And this was one of those evenings, the sky already dark, the wind at her back, her breath coming out in front of her in ragged white sheets. She cut through the lot behind the old Ferndale feed store because it saved her the long way around the block, and that was where she heard it. Not the crying yet. First the laughter. The flat, mean kind that has nothing underneath it. Then a voice, young and loud and pleased with itself. You think that patch means something, old man? You think anybody out here is going to do a damn thing? Nora came around the corner of the loading dock and stopped. There were 4 of them, none of them older than 22 or 23, dressed in the loose, careful way that young men dress when they want you to think they're dangerous. 2 had their phones up, recording. 1 had his boot against the front wheel of a motorcycle, a big touring bike, black and chrome, rocking it back and forth like he was deciding whether to lay it down. And on the cracked asphalt between them was a man, 60 maybe older, heavyset, a gray beard gone yellow at the corners from years of cigarettes. He wore a black leather vest crowded with patches, and his lip was split and running, and his right hand was pressed flat against the ground like the ground was the only thing keeping him upright, and it was shaking. He was trying to get up. He kept not being able to. His name, though nobody in that parking lot knew it, was Earl Dunmore, and 40 years earlier he had come home from a war that most of the country had decided to forget, and he had spent the 4 decades since being, by nearly every account, a hard and honorable man. The people who rode with him called him Deacon, because he was the one who said the words when they buried their own, and he had buried a lot of them. He was the president of the Ridgeline chapter, a veterans club that ran toy drives at Christmas and pulled stranded drivers out of ditches on the interstate at 2 in the morning and asked nothing for it. He was the kind of man 4 punks should never have been able to touch. But 4 days earlier, Earl Dunmore had gone under the knife for a knee that a piece of shrapnel had been slowly destroying since 1971, and he'd been out of the hospital exactly 30 hours. And he was diabetic, and he had skipped his afternoon insulin because he'd wanted to ride his bike 1 loop around the town he loved before the snow closed the passes, and his blood sugar had crashed on him in that parking lot, like a wave pulling out from under his feet. When the first of them had shoved him, he'd gone down like a man made of paper. And he'd stayed down, and his body simply would not answer him. He was a lion with his legs cut out from under him, and the worst part, the part he would carry longer than the split lip, was that he understood exactly what was happening and could do nothing at all. The one crouched in front of him leaned in close. "Say it again," he said. "Say please. Everybody wants to hear it." Nora didn't decide anything. That was the part she could never explain afterward. No matter how many people asked her, she didn't weigh it. She didn't count the four of them against the one of her. Something in her had already moved before the thinking part of her caught up. The same way her hand already knew where the misfire was, before she'd finished hooking up the scanner. She had a tire iron in her hand. She didn't remember picking it up. She'd been carrying it out to reseat a customer's spare and never set it down, and now it was in her fist and she was already crossing the lot, fast and low and quiet, and the wind ate the sound of her boots. The one with his phone up saw her first and his face did something confused, because what he saw coming was a young woman in coveralls, and confusion cost him the half-second he needed. She didn't swing at him. She stepped between the crouched one and the old man, put her back to Earl Dunmore and brought the tire iron up level. Not high, not wild, just up. Held the way you hold a wrench you're about to torque down hard, and she said, in a voice that came out flatter and colder than she felt, "Back up." For a moment nobody moved. The wind pushed a flattened cardboard box across the lot, and then the whole thing happened very fast. The one who'd been rocking the motorcycle came at her, and Nora did the only thing 5 years of hauling engine blocks and breaking loose seized bolts had trained into her body, which was to plant, to root herself to the ground the way Gus had taught her, and she drove the flat of the tire iron into the meat of his forearm. As he reached for her and he screamed and folded. The crouched one lunged and she pivoted and the iron caught him across the shoulder, and he went sideways into the motorcycle, and the whole thing came down on top of him in a crash of chrome. Two of them left standing. One had already stopped recording. She didn't chase. She stepped back over Earl Dunmore's legs, put herself square in front of him again, and she said the same thing, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. "Back up." They backed up. 8 seconds start to finish, maybe less. One of the phones had caught all of it. Then they were gone, two of them helping the other two, cursing over their shoulders, and the lot was empty except for a fallen motorcycle and an old man on the ground, and a young woman standing over him with a tire iron, and a heart going so hard she thought she might be sick. The people who'd been filming from the safe distance drifted off too, the way people do, and not one of them came to help her lift the bike or check on the man. And Nora would remember that for a long time, longer than she'd remember the fear, the watching, the way so many people could see a thing clearly and still decide it wasn't theirs to carry. She dropped to her knees beside Earl Dunmore. Hey, look at me. Are you okay?" He wasn't. He was gray and clammy, and his eyes were sliding around like they couldn't find a place to land. And Nora, who'd spent 5 years diagnosing things that couldn't tell her what was wrong with them, knew the difference between a man who's been beaten and a man who's shutting down. "Are you diabetic?" she asked. His head moved, barely a nod. Nora didn't have candy. She had a warm can of Coke in her coverall pocket that she'd been saving for the walk home, and she cracked it and got an arm behind his heavy shoulders and tipped it slow against his split lip and said, "Drink, come on, drink." And she called 911 with her other hand and kept talking to him the whole time, kept her voice level, told him her name, told him about Gus, told him anything, told him the wind was going to have to go through both of them if it wanted him. And somewhere in the middle of all that nonsense, the old man's hand came up and closed around her wrist, not to push her away, but to hold on. "You ride?" he said. It was the first full thing he'd managed. His voice was a wreck. "No," Nora said. "I fixed them." Something moved in his ruined face that might have been the start of a smile. "Of course you do," he said. The ambulance came. Nora stayed until they had him on the gurney and stable, and she gave the police her statement standing in the cold with a shock blanket around her shoulders that she didn't remember accepting. And she told them the truth, which was that she didn't know what had come over her. And then she walked the rest of the way home, with the tire iron still in her hand because she'd forgotten she was holding it. And she let herself into the empty house on Geyser Street, and sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and shook for a while. And then she got up and made herself eggs because she hadn't eaten since noon, and she went to bed. She didn't tell her mother. She figured it was over. It was not over. She found out the way she found out about most things, which was late and from somebody else. She was under a Silverado at 2 the next afternoon when Cole Ferris came skidding into the shop on his bicycle, breathless, 16 years old and vibrating, and shouted her name into the pit until she rolled out on the creeper. "You're on the internet," he said. "Nora, you're everywhere." The clip was 39 seconds long. Somebody had posted it that morning with a caption Nora would never have chosen, and the algorithm had picked it up and thrown it. And by the time Cole showed it to her on his cracked phone, it had a number under it that didn't make sense. And by the end of that day, the number was in the millions. There she was, small and dark against the gray light, stepping in front of an old man while everyone else stepped back. You couldn't see her face clearly. You could see exactly what she did. The comments were a country talking to itself. Half of them were about her. Half of them were about everyone standing around filming instead of helping. A lot of them were people saying where they were watching from. Little flags planted all over the map. A woman in Ohio, a trucker in Alabama, a retired school teacher in Maine who wrote that she'd watched it 4 times and cried each time and that it reminded her the country wasn't as far gone as the news made it feel. Nora hated it. That was the honest truth of it, and it surprised even her. She didn't want a country's worth of eyes on the worst 8 seconds of somebody else's life. She'd done a small thing, the smallest thing, the thing anybody should have done, and the fact that anybody had to be praised for it struck her as evidence of exactly how sick things had gotten. Gus watched the clip over her shoulder on Cole's phone, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he put his big hand on her shoulder and squeezed once and went back to work. And that was the most either of them ever said about it out loud. But there was a part of the story that hadn't reached the internet yet, and it was moving toward Nora Keene faster than she knew. Because a man named Earl Dunmore had woken up that morning in a hospital bed with a phone full of messages and a video he'd watched with tears running into his gray beard. And Earl Dunmore was not a man who let a debt sit. He'd made one call to a man he'd ridden beside for 30 years, and that man had made 3 more. And by nightfall, the story of what had happened behind the Ferndale feed store was traveling along a set of wires that had nothing to do with any algorithm, moving chapter to chapter, state line to state line, the old way, phone call by phone call. The way news traveled among men who'd learned to distrust every other way of hearing it. The man on the other end of Earl's first call was named Walt Senna, and he was the closest thing the Ridgeline organization had to a founder still living. He was 71. He'd been shot twice, once by an enemy and once by a friend, and he'd forgiven both. He ran a small motorcycle repair and restoration shop outside Bozeman as a way of staying sane, and he was standing in the doorway of it at 6 the next morning, watching the light come up gray over the eastern hills, when his second in command, a quiet, careful man named Booker, who did most of the organization's actual thinking, came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him. "You watched it," Booker said. "It wasn't a question. I watched it," Walt said. "She wasn't scared," Walt said after a while. "That's the thing people keep saying, that she was brave, but that's not what I saw. Brave is when you're scared and you go anyway. She wasn't scared. She was just already there." Already, he blew on his coffee. "You know how rare that is? I've known that in maybe 5 people my whole life. Earl's one." He looked at Booker. "I want to know everything about her before we go." Booker had already started. That was Booker's way. He'd spent half the night on it, and what he'd found had only deepened his interest. Because the video was 39 seconds, and the story underneath it was 5 years long. There was the garage owner, Reynard, who'd hired her off nothing. There was a boy named Cole Ferris, whose car she kept alive for free. There was a whole street's worth of people who, when a reporter from the Bozeman paper had started knocking on doors that morning, had all said some version of the same thing. Of course she did that. That's Nora. She's been doing things like that as long as we've known her. Booker set down his coffee. "Earl asked us to find her and thank her," he said. "But I'll tell you what I actually found. I found a girl who's been doing the right thing for years in places where there was no camera. The video's just the one time somebody happened to be pointing a phone at her." Walt Senna nodded slowly, and he looked out at the light coming up over the hills, and he thought about something he'd believed for a very long time, which was that the hardest thing in the entire world to find was a person who did good simply because it was the only thing that made sense to them. Not for credit, not for leverage, not because anyone was watching, just because they couldn't do anything else the way water couldn't run uphill. He'd spent his life looking for people like that, and he'd built something to hold the few he found. "We're going," he said. "Get the word out. And Booker, tell them to keep it small. This kid's going to hate a spectacle." He was right about that. He would turn out to be right about a lot of things. They came on a Saturday, 4 days after the parking lot, and Booker had failed entirely to keep it small, because you cannot tell 300 people who owe a debt to a man like Earl Dunmore that they can't come and expect them to listen. Nora was under a car when she heard it, and at first she thought it was the wind again, that low continuous rolling sound, and then Gus came into the shop very slowly with a strange look on his face and said, "Nora, you'd better come out here." She rolled out from under the Silverado, wiped her hands, and walked to the open bay door, and she stopped. They filled the street. They filled the street, and they were still coming, a river of chrome and leather moving slow through the gray Livingston afternoon. Headlights on in the daytime the way riders do at a funeral or a homecoming, and they came to a stop in front of Reynard's garage, and they cut their engines, 300 of them at once, and the silence that dropped down after all that noise was the loudest thing Nora had ever heard. She stood in the doorway in her coveralls with a shop rag in her hands, and she did not know what her face was doing. A big man in the front swung off his bike, slower than he wanted to, favoring a knee, and he took off his helmet, and it was the old man from the parking lot, Earl Dunmore. His lip had scabbed over. He'd shaved the beard down to something neater. He crossed the distance to her with a cane in one hand, and he stopped in front of her, And for a moment, the president of the Ridgeland chapter, a man who had said words over more graves than he could count, could not find any words at all. When they came rough. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 4 days, he said. I still don't have it right. He looked down at the cane, then back up at her. You stood over me. You put your back to me and you faced them. And you didn't know me from a stranger on the road. And every other person there decided I wasn't their problem. He shook his head slowly. I've spent my whole life around men who'll tell you they'd do that. I've buried some of them. And a kid in coveralls with a tire iron did it without thinking twice so. He held out his hand, and it was still not entirely steady. Thank you, from all of us. He gestured behind him at the river of them filling the street, every single one. Nora took his hand. She said the only thing she had, which was the truth. Anybody would have. Earl Dunmore's face did something complicated. No, he said gently. That's just it, sweetheart. Excuse me, that's just it. Nobody did. Walt Senna came off his bike then, and he was introduced, and Nora had no idea who he was, and it didn't matter because he didn't lead with any of it. He didn't tell her about the organization, or the shops, or the men who'd ridden across 2 state lines that week to stand in the road in front of her. He just looked at her for a long moment with pale, steady eyes, and then he looked past her into the garage, at the tools hung in their careful rows, at Gus standing in the shadows, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, a 16-year-old boy peering around the doorframe with his mouth open. And Walt Senna smiled a little, like a man who had found exactly what he'd driven a long way to find. You keep this place running for people who can't pay, he said. It wasn't a question either. Nora glanced at Gus. Gus keeps it running, she said. I just work here. Walt nodded slowly, filing that away too, the deflection, the way she moved credit off herself before it could land. That's what he'd read in Booker's notes, and it was another kind of true when you saw it in person. He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that you didn't recruit people like this. You couldn't. The moment you offered someone like Nora Keene a reward for who she was, you insulted the thing that made her that way. You just stayed close and you waited, and you gave them bigger and harder rooms to be themselves in. They didn't stay long that day. They were not, whatever the internet thought, a spectacle by choice. Earl left her a card with a number on it and said, if you ever need anything, you call that and you won't get a stranger. Walt Senna shook Gus's hand and stood in the shop for a while talking quietly about a 1966 shovelhead he was restoring, one professional to another, and Nora watched Gus, who never talked to anybody, talk to this old stranger for 20 minutes like they'd known each other for years. And then they fired up 300 engines. And the wind carried the sound of them out of Livingston and away east toward the mountains, and the street was empty again, and it was just Nora and Gus and Cole in the gray light, and none of them said anything for a while. That should have been the end of it. A good story, a viral clip, a grateful club, a young woman who went back to work. The country got its 39 seconds of proof that people like that still existed and moved on to the next thing the way it does. But the story Walt Senna had come to Livingston to find was not the story of 8 seconds behind a feed store. And over the 2 years that followed, Nora Keene would slowly come to understand that too. It started with the 4 young men. Because the country had questions, and Nora had them too, and this was the part that didn't fit into 39 seconds. The video had faces in it, clear enough, and it turned out one of them was already known to the county for other things, and within a week all 4 had been picked up. Nora had to go to the courthouse, and she sat in a hard chair in a cold room and watched them file in, and up close, out of the dim parking lot, they were even younger than she'd thought. And it did something strange to her anger, seeing them like that. 3 of them stared at the floor, but the 4th one, the one who'd been crouched in front of Earl saying, "Say please," looked at her across the room with an expression she couldn't read, and it wasn't defiance. It looked more like a boy who had discovered something about himself in a parking lot that he was going to have to carry, now whether he wanted to or not. 3 of them took their sentences and vanished back into whatever had made them. But the 4th one, a 19-year-old named Trey, whose father Nora would later learn had been in and out of prison his whole childhood, wrote her a letter from the county lockup. It was 2 pages in careful, cramped handwriting, and it did not ask for anything, and it did not fully make sense. And about half of it was a boy trying to explain to himself how he'd become someone who would kick a sick old man in a parking lot for a laugh, and the last line said only, "I don't have a reason. I just wanted you to know I know there isn't one." Nora sat with that letter for a long time. Then she did something that surprised even Gus. She wrote back. That was the first thread. Cole Ferris was the second, because the video had made Nora briefly, uncomfortably famous in Livingston. And Cole, who'd worshipped her for years, started coming by the shop even more. And Gus started letting him hang around, hand him wrenches, learn a little. And one gray afternoon, Nora looked up from a brake job and watched a 16-year-old boy, who came from a house not much steadier than Trey's, carefully, proudly, correctly torque down a lug nut to spec, and check it twice because she taught him to check it twice, and go quietly to the sink to wash his hands without being asked. And something turned over in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. Walt Senna had a word for it. When Nora finally called the number on Earl's card almost a year later, it wasn't for herself. It was because Cole had turned 17 and had nowhere to go after his mother lost the house. And Nora had run out of ways to fix it on $20 an hour, and she'd remembered the old man saying, "You won't get a stranger." She got Walt himself. She told him about the boy. And Walt Senna, on the other end of the line, closed his eyes and smiled, because this was the thing he'd been waiting a whole year to hear. Not a request for help for herself, which never came and never would, but a call about somebody else. What he told her about then was the thing he'd built. It didn't have a grand name. It had a plain one, because Walt distrusted anything that needed to sound important. It was a network of shops, a handful of them scattered across 3 states, garages and welding outfits and small restoration operations, all of them quietly in the business of finding the Cole Freezes and the Trey Wovers of the world, the kids one bad year away from disappearing and putting a wrench in their hands and a reason to show up in their mornings. Men like Booker ran the logistics. Men like Earl found the money, and what they had never had enough of. Walt said what they were always short on was people who could actually do it. People the kids would believe. People who'd earned the right to say show up every day and not complain because they'd lived it. "I've got shops," he said. "I've got money, some. What I don't have is you. I've got maybe 5 people in 3 states who can look a broke, angry 17-year-old in the eye and mean it when they say it gets better, because they had to claw their own way out of the same hole. You're one of them. You've been one your whole life. The parking lot didn't make you that. It just pointed a camera at you." Nora Keene did not say yes right away. She was not a person who said yes to anything right away. She talked to Gus, who listened for a long time and then said the truest thing he'd ever said to her, which was, "Kid, I always knew I was borrowing you. Go." She talked to her mother, who cried and said go. And she went, but not far and not all at once. She stayed in Livingston. Renard's Garage became the first shop in the network to take on what they started calling, over her strong objection, the Keene kids, and Nora ran it. And Cole Ferris was the first one through the door, and Trey, when he got out 11 months later, was the second. And Nora Keene stood in the bay one gray afternoon and watched 2 boys who had met on opposite sides of a beating in a parking lot work side by side on a stranger's transmission. And neither of them said a word about it, and that silence was the best thing she'd ever built. There were more after that. There was a girl named Rhea, 17 furious, who fabricated her first complete brake line from scratch and then stood staring at it for 30 seconds without a word, before walking very quietly to the far corner of the shop to compose herself, because nobody had ever let her make something that worked before. There was a kid named Danny who came back the second day, which Walt had taught Nora was the only day that mattered, because anybody could show up the first day. There were the ones who didn't stay, and Nora learned to carry those too. Learned that you didn't get to keep all of them, and that the ones you lost weren't a verdict on the work. Earl Dunmore came through Livingston every few months on his way somewhere, knee-heeled, beard grown back, and he'd sit in the corner of the shop drinking coffee and watching Nora move among the kids, and he never got tired of it. 2 years in, on one of those visits, he watched her walk a 14-year-old through a tire rotation with a patience that made his eyes sting. And when she came over to sit with him, he reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft with handling, and slid it across the workbench. "You know what Walt wrote on his notepad the morning after the video?" he asked. "The morning before we wrote out to you?" "No," Nora said. She unfolded it. In an old man's careful block letters were 3 words: "Find more, her." "First." She set it down. "Did he?" she asked. "He started with you," Earl said. "And now you're the one finding the rest of them." And that was the thing Nora Keene finally understood, standing in a gray garage in the town she'd never left, with a scarred piece of notepaper in her black fingernailed hand, and a boy in the corner checking a lug nut twice because she'd taught him to. The 8 seconds behind the feed store were never the story. They were never the point of any of it. The country had needed them, had watched them millions of times, because the country was hungry for proof that people like her still existed. But people like her had always existed. They existed in every town, on every gray street, in every quiet corner where somebody decided, with nobody watching and nothing to gain, and no guarantee it would ever matter to anyone, to do the thing that needed doing. The 8 seconds hadn't made her brave. They'd only caught her being what she already was. On a random Tuesday, the same as every other day, the days with a camera and the 10,000 days without one. The heroes weren't made in 8 seconds. That was what Walt Senna had known his whole long life, and what Earl had written on a folded piece of paper, and what Gus had understood the day he hired a furious 18-year-old off a handshake. They were made in every ordinary morning before that, in the free break jobs and the walked home miles and the warm can of Coke tipped against a stranger's split lip, in every choice made in the dark where there was no one to see it and no one to count it, and no reason to do it except that some people, the rare ones, the ones worth building things around, simply cannot do anything else. Nora Keene was one of them. She always had been. The camera just finally caught it on its way past for 8 seconds, before she went back to the work.